Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Masterclass by Rem Koolhaas, and welcome to the Kunsthal, of course. My name is Emily Antenk. I'm director of the Kunsthal since 9 years, and I'm super happy that you're all here. The Masterclass will be in English. I assume you all speak English. And we invited Rem Koolhaas to do this Masterclass because of our 25th anniversary that we celebrated last night, and today with you as students and friends of the Kunsthal. First of all, I want to thank Nationale-Nederlanden as our sponsor for the series of the masterclasses and as a durable partner for the Kunsthal. And this is the 5th masterclass in a row organized for you, students and friends from the Netherlands and abroad. And I think it's a unique chance for you all to interact with Rem today and with other artists, known artists in this series. I also want to thank het Nieuwe Instituut, one of our neighbors, because they lend out the study maquettes for this building. And of course, I leave it entirely up to Rem and Véronique later on to talk about the design of this building, the fantastic concept, and the many, many choices that were made in 1992, or even before that, started all in 1989. But I would like to start with a few of our experiences in this building as the user, because the Kunsthal is a foundation and the building and the Kunsthal as foundation are the same age. So it's not only about the building, it's also about the content and the programming. And I've looped some photographs of the things we're doing here. As you know, or you might know, in the 1992 when it was first opened, it was not entirely perceived as a fantastic building. It was, the critiques were quite severe sometimes. Not everybody liked it. It came in the press with the leaking ramps and the problems and the entrance and so on and so on. So you can say it was perceived sometimes by some people, by a quite broad audience, as a difficult building, but not for the users, the Kunsthal team. We love this building. And why do we love this building? Because we can do everything and anything in here. It gives us a lot of freedom, and it gives also a lot of freedom to the visitor, because it doesn't have a route that you have to follow. You can really wander around, you can choose your own pace, you can stroll, it makes you reflect. You have to work hard in this building because the ramps and the stairs, there's a lot of stairs, there's a lot of ramps. And with that, there's time to reflect on art and all the things you can see. And with every exhibition, we make a kind of a new world. And if you come here today, you can see the exhibition on Paul Delvaux and the cats. And if you come here 3 months from now, you can see a totally different mix of exhibitions. And I think that's the strength of this building, that we can use it any way we like. And that's not only the exhibition spaces, but also this beautiful auditorium that you're sitting in today. After the masterclass, we'll open the curtains so you have a broad view on the park and the rabbits of the artist Tom Klaassen. We have a cafe that we can use. We had a big party last night, and it also is a very festive space, and we like to use it. And in the summer, we use the terrace between the building of the Historisch Museum and the Kunsthal as a kind of a festival space. And every Sunday, people came here to dance and to enjoy music and art. So I think that's what I want to share with you, that we can do fantastic, beautiful, and very ambitious exhibitions like Alberto Giacometti or Jean Tinguely, Henry Moore, and all those kind of things, but also very other special things. So it works really like a ballet de festival. So I would like to say a few words to Véronique Patteeuw. She will moderate the masterclass. She has a very impressive track record. She has a PhD in architecture, an engineer architect. She's a critique and editor based in Brussels and associate professor at the École Nationale Supérieure d'Architecture in Lille. From 2001 to 2010, she directed architectural publication for NAI publishers in Rotterdam, and since 2005, she's one of the editors of Oase, a journal for architecture, and founding member of A16, a platform for young architecture in Belgium. And she moderated a very successful lecture here a few years ago, I think, it was a few years ago, from Oase. So we're very happy that you're here. And Rem, of course, I want to congratulate you also with the birthday of the Kunsthal, 25 years. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Do you want to take a microphone? No? Okay. I'm very happy to be here. It's a great moment because 2 years ago we presented this issue within the Kunsthal, which was dedicated to the first decade of OMA. Personally, I couldn't be here. I prepared everything, but I was highly pregnant, so I had to lay down and I couldn't make the trip. So I'm very happy I'm here today. The issue of the first decade specifically presented projects by OMA made between 1978 and 1989 with an exhibition in the Boijmans in spring of 1989. And what we did was we looked onto the website of OMA and we looked into all the projects that were developed at that time. 42 projects were developed at that time and 15 of them were executed, amongst which, of course, also the Kunsthal. The Kunsthal was a project developed at the end of this first decade, at the end of the 1980s, a period of intense public debate, of great political challenges, and of a political context which was very important. I'm going to sit in the meantime. The Berlin Wall, of course, fell down. Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of the UK. François Mitterrand was the President in France. And I'm wondering, Rem, as a first question, if this period of intense public debate and of an intense challenging context wasn't a first step towards anticipating the project of the Kunsthal?
Yeah, I think it was very important. And actually, last night we talked about it. You mentioned the fall of the Berlin Wall. In 1991, the Soviet Union disappeared. And in 92, the Treaty of Maastricht. Can I have a show of hands for all of you who know the Treaty of Maastricht? Do you know what it means? Okay, so this is a really depressing situation of Europe today. The Treaty of Maastricht is the defining treaty that was responsible for the current iteration of Europe and the European Union. So the Treaty of Maastricht was an enormous leap forward in the definition of Europe. It discussed, for instance, the euro and introduced the single currency and a whole series of other ambitions. And it really is extremely important to understand this building as a manifesto for a new Europe. In that sense, I really was tangibly and physically inspired almost to try to find an architecture, also a new architecture that would do justice to a new Europe.
It is a project within a series of projects in the office of OMA where the idea of the collective becomes important. I'm wondering if at that time, within the idea of collectivity and the new Europe, if the Kunsthal, but also other projects like the Brugge Sea Terminal, the Très Grande Bibliothèque, Congrexpo, etc., are projects that are searching for new ways to deal with the collectivity.
I think that already in that time there was a kind of feeling that the digital would change everything, and that our culture was changing drastically, and that things would no longer be the same. It's actually interesting that yesterday we had a kind of meeting where a professor explained how culture has changed in the last 25 years, but everyone always kind of represented it as a sudden change, but actually it's been kind of going on for a very, very long time. Discussions about media, for instance, were already kind of happening in the 60s, 70s. So what became clear is that the digital and media would question everything that was physical. Every substantial thing was going to become more virtual, and therefore architecture really had to define a new role or define a new position. And what I felt was important then is that since everybody would be kind of individually kind of relate to individual media, and we all know this kind of position, that architecture could be one device or one medium that could define collectivity and could accommodate the still important desire to be together.
In that way, maybe we can talk about the project.
Can somebody just go on with these pictures? Yeah.
And that maybe it's good to hold on this image. It's if we may.
Yeah, you can point out here.
Maybe it's good to. Maybe it's good to point out here. Of course, the Kunsthal is here in its second version, but with part of a much larger plan, an urban plan on a very important site in Rotterdam, and one of the only sites that were still possible in that time in the city center to build on, with the project by OMA of the Architecture Museum, the current Nederlands Architectuur Instituut, the Boijmans van Beuningen, and of course the Museum Park. 3 projects, actually 4 if I'm correct. A first project for the Kunsthal from 87 to 88, a competition project for the Architectuur Museum 80-80, then a second project for the Kunsthal in 92 and the Museum Park 89-94. So within a short period of time, OMA developed 4 projects for this site.
You want to explain?
No.
No. Okay. No. Yes, it's true. And what I also memorized yesterday is that yes, it was the beginning of Reagan and Thatcher, and therefore the beginning of the market economy, the beginning of the state shifting more and more tasks to the private sector. But it was just the last moment that the state could decide things, or the city could decide things. And in Rotterdam there was a wethouder, Lindhurst, who had the portfolios for finance and culture, and that was a very important combination, who could simply decide who would be doing kind of things in the city. So he asked me first to do the Kunsthal, then we became kind of responsible, and that is a kind of public secret. The Architecture Museum was initially planned here, where now we have will have the collectiegebouw of the Boijmans. We proposed to kind of shift it here, and we did the competition then, and that competition made the first project that we had done here look a bit ridiculous. So in order to do a good, let's say, a good counterpart for the Architecture Institute, we redid the Kunsthal, and then we lost the competition for the Architecture Institute, and so then the Kunsthal stood on its own. A lot of dramatic events.
What is interesting, I thought, is that if you look towards the first project for the Kunsthal and the second one, there's a kind of thread going through. The box stays in a way, the box, the square is still the square, but there's an inversion also, from a very clear and simple plan to something much more complex. Maybe we can talk about this shift, and also maybe you can explain, Rem, why this shift happened in a way.
The shift happened, I think that architecture and this whole history really shows it. It's a kind of incredible combination of a particular ambition, but then all the completely random events or accidents that happen on the way, and kind of how you negotiate all those accidents to result. So what happened is that kind of basically the Kunsthal, the city appointed a director for the Kunsthal. His name was Wim van Kempen, and he basically hated this project. And he said, you know, I cannot work here, I need a black box, and what you've done is terrible. And so therefore we actually had no choice except to start again. And when we started again, of course, it enabled us to be more interesting, and that then kind of led, and you see it here. I think that my voice alone is kind of probably enough. Basically, we always had a problem that the site was located here, but there were kind of there was a pedestrian access kind of running through it. No, please go back to the other. Pedestrian access running through it and a road. So the site was divided in 4 parts before we did anything. And we always had a difficulty to go from here to there. Please stay on that side, yeah? Okay. So we always had the difficulty to go from here to there. And maybe now you can kind of shift a few slides. So then we kind of thought for the first time that what we could do is, please, yeah, okay, yeah. Sorry, but then we decided that we could overcome this kind of problem whereby, if this was the ramp, by making the entry kind of ramp itself that allowed you to go underneath and to go over. And this is one of these kind of rare moments in architecture when you really have the feeling to have invented something, which actually is really rare. I think that kind of maybe in any architectural life there can be maybe 3 or 4 real inventions, not more. And of course this invention then became the ambition to make a building that would represent a kind of continuous loop or a spiral, and that would make the issue of what floor you were on kind of irrelevant. And so simply through this device, this intersection, we could kind of move and keep moving. And Emily just kind of spoke about how versatile the building was, how it left them to do whatever they needed to do in any of the spaces. I think it is really that key moment that triggered those flexibilities.
You talk about inventions, and when we looked into all the projects that you did in the 1980s, I think it's a very important period of this kinds of inventions, where I was wondering if the idea of the fragment of architecture instead of the whole is not an important issue that we can treat also in relation to the Kunsthal, where you think of layers, you think of promenade, you think of an entrance door, etc. Is that a guiding principle, or was it a guiding principle for the Kunsthal, the idea of the fragment?
The 2 things. I think the inventions were really stimulated by political activity, and I would say that kind of one of the paradoxes of the current moment, where innovation is such an important concept and such an important rhetoric. I would say that the market economy itself, kind of simply by putting a commercial pressure on everything, is extremely negative or unfavorable for real inventions. So that maybe we can discuss that later. It was a time of fragmentation. You know, there was Derrida. There were a number of philosophers who seemed to kind of emphasize the fragment over the whole. It was the beginning of postmodernism. People did no longer believe in a kind of large, coherent story, but were kind of more interested in episodes and kind of separate events. But I always had kind of mixed feelings about that, and so yes, I was really alerted to the importance of a fragment, but I always wanted to maintain a kind of overall whole. So I think that even this building, the whole is defined by the kind of circulation, but it is true that the circulation leads you to a series of seemingly unconnected events.
Which I think is one of the very big differences with later projects, because I think in the Kunsthal what is quite nice and what is also very interesting in projects of that same period, the one of the Netherlands Architecture Institute maybe, that we can show, is that, I try to go back, okay, is that there, both in plan and in section, there's an important work on the layering. The idea that there is a kind of complexity in the section of the Netherlands Architecture Institute, I think is very interesting. Whether this section is related to a quite complex plan with the triangle and the socle in it. Yeah. And at the same time, there's also something very easy, very, well, not easy, very eenvoudig, very simple, which is the very regular plan of the construction. So I was wondering if in the Kunsthal, this principle of different elements, the structural element, the section and the plan, are coming back.
Yeah, two things. Basically, in the beginning of the 20th century, they invented the free plan. Free plan was kind of the structure of a building was no longer supported on walls but on columns, and that allowed you to make the wall a kind of much freer object, which could take on any shape and which could be, they called it a free plan. In the second part of the 20th century, it seemed possible to look at a free section or to liberate a section, and I think that that is what the Kunsthal did. A floor did no longer have to be a kind of horizontal plane, but actually it could basically take any shape. It could become a curve, a hill, ramp, and in a way kind of related more to landscape. So I think that that became then a driving kind of idea about behind many of the subsequent buildings, you know, free the section and to think about the section as a separate issue. What I also would like to say is, and which I think is very important for the structure, I said this is a European manifesto, but it is a manifesto by somebody who very aggressively embraced globalization. Because I myself was educated in Indonesia, England, America. I did this with a Japanese co-architect. We had an Indonesian, Italian as a second person in the office. We worked with a Sri Lankan engineer. And so I think that all those impulses were very important. You see, for instance, in the materialization, a Japanese influence, but particularly the idea that each of the three zones of the Kunsthal would have its own autonomous structure. For instance, for those of you who would be sensible for this, we have in the main hall downstairs 5 columns, so it's a kind of asymmetrical column grid. All those were definitely inspired by a kind of collaboration with other cultures.
I think we are touching upon something that I really think is crucial for the Kunsthal, and even if I talk about the Kunsthal with friends, they say that you could reduce the project of the Kunsthal to its structure and to its structural logic. Would that be, could we say that the essence of the project is the idea that you have a very irregular structure in a regular plan, whether of course in the Netherlands Architecture Institute it was the inverse, and that it had an important impact on the composition?
Basically, I think that architecture is, in essence, a collaborative effort, whatever kind of people think. And in the mid-80s, I became friends with Cecil Bowman, the engineer from Sri Lanka. And basically that he enabled, or maybe I should say, I enabled him to think about architecture, and he enabled us to think about structure. So that relationship became a kind of very important driver of a number of the kind of projects. And this is, for instance, kind of the Kunsthal one, where we had Vierendeel trusses kind of supporting the box, and where it became very interesting to simply, where we simply asked, does each Vierendeel truss have to be the same always? No, it doesn't. So then you can vary, and then you can introduce a kind of totally different rhythm that are more kind of related to jazz than to anything classical, I would say.
Oh, I see that we have 5 more minutes, so this is very, very frustrating, because I think it would be nice to talk for 2 days about this project. Okay,
we can do that.
We can do that, so we... I'll skip some questions, and I still have 2 more, which I would like to ask. In the way that the projects were represented at that time, and I think it's very nice also if we look to the model, or if you look to some of the collages that I saw in the archives about the Kunsthal, there is this kind of lack of sophistication in the representation. It's quite brutal, it's quite rough, it's quite unfinished, and I think it was meant to be that way. And I was wondering if it was meant to be that way because it was a kind of aesthetic that you very much believed into at that time, or if it was also a way to start a dialogue with the client or with other persons in the team to work on the project.
Well, I think this is really a very important issue. And this is totally out of context, but in the Biennale I organized in 2014, I said that our values had changed kind of really drastically, and that from the French Revolution, égalité, fraternité, liberté, we are now addicted to comfort, security, and sustainability. And particularly our addiction or commitment to comfort, I consider, first of all, also an expression of the market economy, but also extremely negative for any sense of challenge, any sense of adventure, and any willingness to take any risks. This is obviously a building that takes risk, and it's obviously a building that challenges, and obviously a building that is not dedicated to comfort in the first place. In that sense, I think that that we are now kind of forced almost to produce renderings. I think that renderings are kind of really the most repulsive architectural tools, because they show a kind of situation, what it will look like. And I think that is completely counterproductive to thinking, to intellectual kind of pursuits, to showing how things work.
Maybe just to continue about that, when we were in the archives of OMA, I discovered this project Casa Palestra that you did in '86 in Milan, where there's a series of collages with even actually the articles in which you cut all the little persons that were in your collages, showing a representation or a scenario or snapshots of a life that could be possible in Casa Palestra, in this pavilion. And at the same time, we discovered also other collages, which were collages of the NAI, of the Patio Villa, and of the Kunsthal, where you saw that there's a kind of thickness given to the facades with different materials that were cut out and put on. And so I was wondering how the role of the facades was an important one in developing the Kunsthal. We have 4 different facades. They're layered. They have different materialities. Was materiality important at that time?
Of course, it was, and basically I came. I studied in London at the AA from '68 to '72. The biggest influence was maybe Charles Jenks, who wrote the book on postmodern architecture. He became a friend, and he was completely relentless and almost daily confronting me with my inability to do facades. And it really became a problem. Our friendship survived, but he gave me a kind of enormous inferiority complex. And so I think that, you know, all of my facades are born in inferiority complex, and with the basic understanding that I can't do facades. So it's a kind of desperate struggle to find alternative materials, alternative ways, alternative sensations. For instance, this is a kind of important moment in my thinking about facades, kind of different relationships between the mechanical and the material, between transparency and opacity, and between stability and instability, refinement and brutality.
We come to the word brutal. It's written down here. I have two more questions. I start with one if I can. I'll keep the brutality for the last one. I go back to my other question. Something that you mentioned in the interview that my colleagues had with you here 2 years ago, I found very inspiring, is about also the context of that time, in which it was a very difficult political context, a very challenging political context and economical context, but it was also a very challenging architectural context. Why? Because at that time, architects still had different positions, and they explicitly wrote about their positions or expressed their positions to their buildings. So we were in a context where there were different architectural ideologies in which you, as Rem Koolhaas, OMA, needed to find a place. Is the Kunsthal one such an example of finding a place in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands, at that time, with these ideologies?
Yeah, of course. Our architecture is and was a kind of quite a crowded field. And basically, I think I had a kind of advantage and disadvantage at the same time, because I was completely not educated, but completely part of an Anglo-Saxon discussion of architecture that was completely different from what was here. Basically, here people were talking about menselijkheid. That was a word you would never hear in America. And in America, kind of formal issues were kind of really much more crucial. And the relationship between philosophy and architecture at the time was also very crucial. So when I came here, I had a kind of sophistication, but no credibility, because anything I was interested could not be described in the Dutch language. And so in that sense, it became very important for me to have one single intervention in Dutch culture, so that it would intersect at least.
With the Kunsthal, who is located in a historical, between brackets, site, because I don't know if you can speak about history in Rotterdam, if we look into the context after the Second World War, but a context next to Boijmans, which was a kind of vacancy in which you decided to make this building in close relationship to the surroundings.
I think that Rotterdam actually was very influential, and simply by being here it became very influential, because supposedly this whole city had been destroyed. It was clearly kind of reconstructed, but you could also see that there were already different waves and different mentalities reconstructing. So actually it was a total chaos of kind of fragments of old buildings with fragments of modernist kind of entities, with kind of fragments of post-modern architecture. So I think out of, maybe out of modesty, I always felt it was very important to be contextual, but perhaps not in the traditional sense of the word, where contextual means to be similar. I was kind of fascinated, for instance, with the Westzeedijk, with the park, and that, all those contrasts and relationships became very crucial in defining what we did.
Come to my last question. I have to stop. Okay, last question. We are in a building which we celebrate today, 25 years, and still it feels like this is a building which is very accurate towards our present context, which is even not searching for a relationship with its context, but it has a kind of timelessness. And I was wondering in preparation of this this day today, how come? So I had a lot of ideas about it. I thought it was related to the fragment, to the structure, etc. But then I listened to what you said 2 years ago, and you had 3 words, and I'm going to repeat them, that I found really very inspiring. You told me that, or my colleagues, that architecture, or your architecture, was brutal, boring, and blatant. And so I kind of thought about it. So brutal is without any attempt to disguise unpleasantness. Boring is non-interesting, and blatant is a lack of subtlety. So you're not wanting to please, you do not want to be or seem interesting, and you do not believe in subtlety. Would that be the key of the Kunsthal?
Unfortunately not. Because I think that architecture, whether we want to or not, is not only the buildings, but is also the language we use around it. And so therefore there's always an amazing kind of rhetorical apparatus which is necessary to partly reinforce, but partly also to contradict the things. So yes, in public I'm for brutality, but of course I work enormously on kind of refinement. On public I don't want to be interesting, but in private I try to find intellectual concepts that don't demand to be admired, but that at least create an interest. And blatant, well, it's harder and harder to be blatant.
Thank you, Rem. We continue this talk with 3 presentations of the students. I'm very much interested to see, although there is not a specific connection with the Kunsthal, if these ideas of brutality, pleasantness, boringness, blatantly will become possible or visible in the projects of the students, which are a new generation of designers, architects and vormgevers that we will see now. So I have to invite them. I have to invite the TU Delft students to the floor.
He's just getting our model.
So, hello everyone. At first we would like to thank the Kunsthal for inviting us today, because we think it's a great opportunity to show our project we're working on. You have talked a lot about the history of this building and the history of architecture, but for now we want to go into the future, and our project is called Rotterdam 2040. But before, let's introduce ourselves a little. We are David.
And I'm David as well. I'm a third-year architecture student at the TU Delft, and I'm following my minor at the moment, House of the Future.
My name is David van Rijn, and I'm studying at the Industrial Design Engineering faculty of TU Delft, and I'm in the same minor called House of the Future.
Yeah, so this minor actually challenges us to imagine and shape a future in which we then will try to design and build. Yeah, so let's get in our scenario.
Yeah, so designing the house of the future starts with designing the future. And I want to get you all into our project and imagine a car-free city where corporations rule the empty streets. So how will the future city look like? We say it's built out of 3 layers. There will be living twice as many people as today. Streets will be car-free, and corporations will rule the empty streets. And I hear you thinking, what are corporations? We already heard the marketing community today coming by, and we think they have a major role in our future.
Yeah, so we actually took 3 examples to symbolize this trend. And let's get into one, for example, Uber. We find it's really interesting that Uber doesn't really have anything. They don't have any cars or taxi drivers. They just have these digital platforms that allows people in the city to serve for other people in the city to bring them from A to B. Well, actually, with these companies providing this many and getting more and more into, providing more and more, we believe that they will eventually go into the housing market. We try to make harsh statements for our scenario, so in the end, that gives us boundaries for our design. But we believe they go in the housing market, and from rental houses and houses that you can buy in the past, you will also get subscription-based housing. And this trends in the city will lead to extreme hyperdensity. And this hyperdensity, if we take a look at the next picture we want to show you. Yes, it's Material World by Peter Menzel. He photographs people in front of their house with all their products. And as you see, they have a real big amount of material products in their house, which probably, if you take a look at the washing machine, they don't even use that often. So we believe that this hyperdensity will lead to sharing, that we're gonna need to be sharing in the city, which is pretty hard to facilitate.
Yeah, so we will start sharing, and David already talked to you about digital platforms providing services, and in a city we will try to enhance it by forming physical platforms where we can start sharing stuff. And to build physical platforms in a city where twice as many people live as today, we need space, because otherwise we can't build. And where are we gonna find this space? We just said we're gonna find it in the streets. Technological development shows us cars being autonomously driven, and as David said, sharing becomes a necessity in the future city. If we start sharing the car and the car becomes autonomous, the whole human transport system will be much more efficient. And we said it will be so efficient, it could be underground or maybe in the air, leaving the streets empty. You can see it in the picture on the right. Maybe it's hard to see, but the green space is the space that comes free when cars will leave the streets. We took Rotterdam for a reason, because we saw a picture today of Rotterdam being completely ruined after World War II. This is a city where we have designed, it's quite a young city, and we designed it as a whole around the infrastructure of a car, leaving us with wide streets. So there will be a lot of space available for us as an architect to design in. Let's go to another phase, which is the fun part for an architect, I guess. And that's where you can start visualizing and designing towards the future.
Yeah, so we're still in a quite early phase of the project, actually. We've been in 3 weeks and we just finished our scenario, and the next 2 months will be all about realizing these buildings and visualizing them. But one interesting thing is, as you see, for sure, the infrastructure network, it's a network. So, as we've said before, sharing a washing machine can be, how do you imagine it? You can't bring it to your neighbor that easily. So we want to actually try to implement this in this network where we build buildings that provide this shared living and physical platforms for all the existing digital platforms.
Yeah, this is an image that shows what we think could happen. We don't want to make everything in the open space. We have a great open street, which is maybe 50 to 40 meters wide. If we just place a building right in between, then all the streets become really narrow. So we say, let's lift the whole thing up using the free program. And then the open space is still the place for everyone. And talking about the place for everyone, we thought that would be an interesting connection to make to the Kunsthal where we are today, because the Kunsthal is a place for everyone, and this is a platform where people can criticize or talk about society and show what's good and what's bad. And we thought, how can a museum in the future like this still be the platform for everyone? We see it a bit like this. A museum, a place where everyone can speak about society. creates feedback about society. And big corporations, they are really interested in what's going on in society because they can use this feedback and develop it into new services that are then directly provided again to the society. So we thought it would be an interesting thing today to talk with Mr. Koolhaas about how can you design for the future and how can you, what are the things you take in consideration when you want to design a semi-public space in such a future. Also to the fact that he is designing the new museum in New York in the nearby future. So that's basically it.
We have a small change of plans. We will have the 3 presentations first, and then have a discussion with everybody. That I think it's much more stimulating that way. So I invite now the group of TU Eindhoven. En dan komen jullie straks gewoon terug.
Hello everyone, my name is Eva, and on behalf of our entire graduation study called The Aesthetics of Sustainability, I will present to you our master plan, which we are working on currently for Slussen. And I would like to thank Delft as well for the presentation, because I think we have a very similar topic, so I think it will be very interesting for the discussion as well. This is Slussen. It is located in the center of Stockholm, just between the old town and the southern island. The Slussen is a boat lock, and it has been changing and undergoing change as a result of every new condition in time. It started as a boat lock, then it became the complex city called Slussen Ellende, meaning Slussen misery, because it was too crowded and chaotic. And then continued to be a new condition of a road structure, dubbed by Corbusier as the first modernist structure. And then currently building Foster Partners' master plan, also integrating current types of transport and also creating more space for leisure, as you can see as an effect. However, all of these plans, they react to the conditions of the time, and we would like to propose a plan that reacts to conditions of the future. According to a collection of sources, cars will be less and less important in Stockholm in the future. This is necessary to reach climate goals, but it also can be seen as part of a larger trend. We imagine 3 types of transport in Stockholm. We imagine pedestrians and bicyclists remaining, and of course the boats. We imagine buses and metros, however, to be discontinued because smart vehicles can drive us to any location that we would like, meaning no more bus stops, no more parking spaces, because these things will be driving around the clock. And we imagine a fast type of transport in between cities, such as a hyperloop. So this is what happens when smart traffic comes into play. Normal roads becomes denser, roads can become smaller, and with this increasing population in Stockholm and the decreasing of the road structure, the public space will become more and more important. So this is what happens if you take all of the infrastructure out of Slussen, and you see this enormously generous space appearing. And this is what we would like to work with. So we actually imagine that in this new future, in this new condition, the only reason to go to a transport hub is not actually to transfer, because there will only be these types of transport, And we would only need to transfer maybe from a Hyperloop to a car. But then again, mostly we would go to these transfer hubs for leisure, to relax, to meet each other, to play sports. And especially in this dense population, we imagine this to be the future for Slussen. So this is the boat lock. Then we have the Hyperloop, the important pedestrian connection, and combined together you can still see that this place is still an important place for connections. So imagine one design, which is just one proposal, and on the road to our master plan. The boat lock, this is a superstructure that connects the two places. There's a Hyperloop with next to it a Hyperloop station, and also a place to rise to both levels. And here, a structure to support the smart car sharing system that can be accessed by all pedestrians. And then this pedestrian structure, which is actually a very large landscape that is to be dominated by leisure. So this would be the landscape, combining two parts of the city, where you can play sport, where you can watch a theater, and from it you can connect to this smart car system or take the Hyperloop, but mostly it would be a place to go and spend some time. Would it look a bit like this? And we tried to take this complexity from all of these types of transport and take it into this, make it into this new proposal. And well, we would like to talk with you about how do you see the new spaces that arise, the old transport spaces, how can we use them, and how can we take these old parts of the city and give them a new life.
Thank you. Last presentation of the Willem de Kooning Academy.
Hello everyone, my name is Dave van Leeuwen. I'm a fourth year student of the Willem de Kooning Academy. And I will present to you my case study about Museum Park, and I call it Museum Plein, Museum Square in English. I started this project in Copenhagen. I was there on a field trip with my class, and we searched for a positive outdoor space. Because we used the book A Pattern Language from Christopher Alexander, and we used this pattern 106, a positive outdoor space, and we looked what positive outdoor spaces are like. So back to Rotterdam, we got the museum square, the museum park, I mean. I started with this idea of how the park would look like if the buildings were be on a square, and I will explain to you what a positive outdoor space is. It means that when the surrounding buildings make together a new space in between them. So as you can see here, the Boijmans, the Kunsthal, the Gemeentehistorisch Museum, the depot and the NAI, all collected together will form a square. And this is what it would look like in a plan. But to get to a real plan, I started with different forms. I'll show you the current situation first. I'm sorry. This is how the buildings are located right now, but there's coming a new building. It's the addition of the depot of Boijmans van Beuningen by MVRDV. It's a reflecting bowl, and it will be placed in the park next to the Boijmans van Beuningen. I started doing figure ground studies with all the buildings that are in the park. So I make little models of it, and I looked what a positive outdoor space could be with all these buildings. But then still I would have the current situation, because I can't just pick up these buildings with my models, but I would still have a limited space. and that's the park itself. So I need to place it in a context and put these models again in a place and see where they would work the best as a square. And within this process, I found out that the east side of the park is the best site to place these buildings. So here again is the current situation. And what I did is I moved the buildings to these places. But then I would still need to add the depot. And I thought the depot is quite an interesting building. It reflects the surroundings and it could reflect the other musea. So I thought it should be in the middle of the square. But then this would happen and it would break up the positive outdoor space. There would be no such big square. So I decided, let's pick up this depot and turn it around and put it back in the ground. So it would open up the space and it would still feel like a big square. From then on, I started looking at the infrastructure surrounding the park, and then I made a design that's based on the structure. I added an extra opening in the Boijmans van Beuningen. So instead of this square between the building itself, you could go through the building, because otherwise the building would separate the square from the park. And in my idea, they should be separated, but there should still be a connection, and that is going through the Boijmans van Beuningen Museum. And this is what it would look like with a huge depot inside. If it would be in the way it is planned now, it would look like this, and it wouldn't feel like a square. So I did this. I picked it up, turned it around, and put it back in the ground. And as you can see, it now feels more as a public and open space. Here again, you can see the difference. So what if we turned around this depot and put it in the ground? It would be mostly away, and only the tip of it will come out of the ground. And it would look like this in a section. And you see that the depot is no longer bigger than the other buildings surrounding it. In fact, it's lower and put in the ground. And as you can see in this picture too, you see there's a huge square surrounding all the surrounded by all the existing musea. And this is what the Boijmans would look like if you could go through it. And then at last, you can see how it would feel like a square. For people who were looking very closely at my renderings, I put a guy in it, Wally. If you want to see my renderings again or see more of it, I'm Dave van Leeuwen. You can search my website and check the renderings. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you well. Thank you very much, Dave, Eva, David, and of course all the students, I think, that are also present who worked on these projects. I think it must be very challenging for you now to have had this presentation and have comments. For us, it's quite difficult, of course, to react, but we'll do our very best. As a kind of a general remark before we go to each and one of the projects, what I think is interesting, and Rem, you can like disagree or agree with me, is that all of them are future-oriented, but not exactly in the same ways. Some are looking very much to a very near future and a very specific location. Other ones are looking more into the larger future. But they all deal with the idea of publicness. I think that's an important issue that we can treat. What would be the new publicness in 2014, 2050. And is it related, because that's the second thing I saw in all of the projects, to the ground floor, to what we do with the public space inside on the ground floor of our buildings, I think to the first example, but also the outside space in between buildings. What is the role that we give to this ground floor? Can it be a space for a kind of new collectivity? Is it related, and that's a third point that I have, is it then related to the idea of leisure, on the museum park, the proposal of Slussen, but also to sharing? And if it's related to sharing, what do we share exactly?
I would like to discuss maybe a different aspect. I'm kind of really completely surprised by the incredible optimism they emanate. Optimism about the nature of mankind, optimism about the stability of politics, optimism about the homogeneity of expectations, optimism. In other words, I would like to first hear from the different parties where they got their optimism, and of course, any demonstration of optimism is extremely inspiring and welcome. But in certain cases, I think it's important, particularly to if you look at the future and if you believe that architecture needs to have some credibility, that it has a degree of robustness vis-à-vis known realities or plausible realities. So what I would like to ask, are all these European kind of propositions, and what kind of Europe are they predicting? Are they able to? Are they an extension of the kind of vision of Thierry Baudet, or are they post-Thierry Baudet? Or in other words, what is their relationship with politics? I mean, maybe that is kind of really the beginning.
Shall we start with David and David?
Yeah, in other words, you basically can predict, and I assume that there is a degree of irony in it, but if there isn't, I would like you to say so, because then we understand each other better. But do you even believe that Google, Uber, and the other will exist in 25 years?
Yeah, to start with that, we took those three companies. We took those three companies as a symbol in our scenario because we try to relate it to what people know by today. Of course, it could be other companies rising up in the future. But for us, in our minor, we try to come up with a scenario that creates a context for us to design. And if we would take all developments, political as well, and social, into our project, maybe it will be a bit too much for us to go into everything. But for the politics side, I think there is something interesting going on, because you could question yourself, if corporations are this powerful in the future, what is the role of politics against them, and what is happening with that?
So basically, this is a kind of post-political, politics have disappeared.
Yes.
And corporations govern. Okay.
Yes, as we said, corporations will rule the empty streets. It's
Right.
it's.
I mean, so I was, I got a little kind of adrenaline kind of thing when I saw that, but then I was kind of very surprised by what the corporations then apparently tolerate, because I was surprised by how sympathetic and cute kind of some of your housing was. And I was wondering whether you had looked far enough back into history, for instance, to see that the Netherlands had a kind of visionary Constant, who actually did a kind of proliferating kind of architectural project over the entire of the Netherlands, which almost like two drops of water. It kind of seemed similar to your kind of thing. So I think that, you know, it was an exciting combination of a social dystopia with the language, resurrection of the language of the 60s, which was absolutely the opposite. So are you aware of that, or is that the game, or a joke, or the strength of your project, or not?
Yes, I think we are aware of that.
So it's basically Constant and Google. Yeah?
Yeah, you could say it like that, maybe. I think so. Yeah, what can I say? I think what we try to do is take this corporate world with our project for now into the extreme, and people having all these projects in their houses, making projects actually one of the biggest challenges in the environment. People talk about transport and food production, but just the products, houses full of toasters, that kind of thing. So we thought that was interesting, and in the next 2 months we'll be designing a building that maybe facilitates this shared economy where we don't need that many projects that everybody having their own, but we can share. And for sure it's maybe a utopian idea, but that's what we might try to achieve in this manner.
I don't think it's maybe an utopian idea, and I think in any case it's very important that you kind of study utopias or make utopian projections. But I think what you need to do kind of maybe first, or maybe it's not too late, is to also criticize or test your own hypothesis to destruction. Because a hypothesis which is kind of simply developing and which hasn't had kind of rigor applied to it or skepticism applied to it is a bit superficial maybe. And in my own case, I've always not so much tried to criticize pressure, but looked at precedent. I was in a kind of school which in a way was very similar in terms of its production, kind of looking at the future, making futuristic thing. Even kind of 40 years ago, there was the kind of prediction that traffic would disappear, that little capsules would go through the air. All of that, you know, was super sympathetic, super nice, super cute. I really wanted to believe in it, but I also lived in a kind of world where the Berlin Wall still existed. So I went to study the Berlin Wall because that for me was also architecture. And I'm not saying that you need to kind of study the Berlin Wall, but it would be impressive if you could actually show or argue why what you are proposing now is fundamentally different from, for instance, Archigram, from Constant, and from other kind of utopias. Where is it different? Because sharing, of course, sharing is the big kind of idea also of the 20th century. The first sharing is kind of in a constructivist Soviet housing where you can share the kitchen, the kind of wash room, the laundry, the kids, the husbands, the wives, everything, and so that is a kind of actually a more radical, already a more kind of radical statement of it. Then there is the kind of sharing of the kind of 60s, which is, again is a kind of radical statement. So where is your idea radical, or where is it different? Yeah, that's my.
I think that lies because you get a subscription of space in our scenario. So we have always owned something in the history. We always owned a building. We owned the material our house is built of. We owned a car. The car is becoming a state of power for us. It's part of our identity. And we think in the future, because the subscription-based society, which is rising right now, maybe we know Swapfiets, where you have the right to get from A to B, will enter also the housing market. There was this project in the Dutch Design Week done by MVRDV, where we have a smart material that can form in everything you want. We, during our brainstorm sessions, sometimes think of we owning only the space to do what you want with the material. So you will get a subscription for maybe 30, 40 cubic meters in our platform to do with such kind of material what you want. And if you're working for Google, you get it in Rotterdam. But if you need work in Berlin, you will just take the Hyperloop underground and will be in Berlin using the same amount of space.
I'm wondering if what you're searching for is related to ownership, because the references that you mention, Constant, New Babylon, Friedman, La Ville Spatiale, the Continuous Monument, but also your own Exodus project, I think, are projects of a certain scale, which is a different scale than the ones that I saw on the models, and are projects which are not proclaiming ownership by individuals. I think they are there for the collective, as the Russian worker clubs were there in the 1920s and 30s. And I'm wondering if politics are gone and we are post-politics and we have corporates or corporations who are dealing with individuals, if individuals still exist as citizens or if they become clients. And so if they need to buy before they can share. And so if the idea of ownership becomes an important element in your project.
Yeah, we actually stated in our scenario that the corporations will be the biggest party in providing and probably being or having a higher hierarchy than the current politic system actually. Yeah.
Can I ask you something about your school? What is the kind of relationship with your teacher? Are they encouraging you, or are they, or are they challenging you, or are they discouraging you? Huh?
Challenging us to try to make these hard statements, so in the end we can, in 2 months, come up with a new way of housing or a building that facilitates and works in that future we.
What we saw as architecture was a kind of preliminary stand-in. Huh?
Yeah. This was the first 4 weeks were doing workshops and trying to come up with different scenarios, and now we are 3 weeks in making our own scenario, which we are going to design in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next.
Next, but one last small thing, because I'm very much interested in the idea of how you will plant the blue little things in your model.
Yeah.
These are it's a preliminary idea of the project.
Yeah.
I was thinking of a project that we are doing in the office in Luxembourg, where only 8% of the ground in Luxembourg is still public property. The rest is completely privatized. So public ground does not exist anymore in Luxembourg. And I'm wondering if we are projecting ourselves in a scenario where corporations take over, if this idea of who owns the ground and who will be living in these and working and sharing in your project will not also be an important element to put into discussion. Who owns the ground? I know that in the visionary projects Rem talked about of the 1960s, there was no ownership of the ground. So I think it could be also interesting to see how that develops in your project. You can react if you want to.
Yeah, that's a tough question, as you can see, but the corporations are getting such a prominent role into our daily lives that they will just claim the space that comes free from the car as first. We saw industrial places in the north of Amsterdam, for example, being left because the industrial companies are going to other places. And there we saw immediately a creative industry going into it. And we used this example throughout our project, and we thought if new space comes free in a hyperdense city where people can build, who would be the most powerful group of people that can take that space? And that's where we thought the corporations come in. because the corporations are also the rule in our scenario why we all want to be in the city. They have this prominent place, so everyone wants to be with them, so they will have the space so that everyone can be with them.
I have one more question, because I'm constantly kind of surprised how resilient the profession of architecture is, in the sense of being able to address, since 5,000 years, the most incredible transformations, changes, kind of reversals, and kind of progressions. It was interesting that this is a project by an architecture student and an industrial designer, because I can really imagine that industrial design will be a lot more prominent with the new technologies, with the new kind of gadget, things turning into gadgets, cars kind of becoming also extensions. So what does your collaboration say, and is it a real collaboration, and you know, or should you become, let's say, more dialectical and more enemies? I have a feeling that actually you would benefit from a situation where you're not operating as a kind of single entity, but where, for instance, you would imagine what kind of structure can maintain his kind of wavy walls, and you should kind of perhaps really technically tell us what the wavy wall, how you can do it, and what kind of pleasures it would provide. Yeah.
That's basically one of the big differences between us, I think. He's an architect and I'm an industrial designer. I think not yet, but we hope we will be. And architects think of context and they design big things only once. We are on another scale. We design much things of something small which is produced 1 million times. And we think more of the user interface, and you will think more of the context.
We know that, but we don't see that in your project. Because I think that there could be, by separating or by kind of turning the two sides in a more articulate form, I think you would be able to illustrate a lot, even about the kind of ownership situation or the corporation situation.
Okay. I think
because it's different. You know, Tesla actually has a lot to say about industrial design and its importance and its impact on kind of sustainability, blah, blah, blah. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, then I invite Eva to the floor. Do you want to bring other persons with you? And the microphones are gone? Ah. Yeah. Okay, I thought it was quite intriguing, the project where you go from misery over road structures to leisure. I kind of put that in perspectives. Thinking about the aesthetics of sustainability, I was intrigued by the idea what you actually do with the infrastructure and how you kind of redefine it as leisure and use it as leisure, or you do something else with it. You continue to create a hub, but is it still a hub only for transportation, or does it become also a hub for program? That was another quite of interesting thing that I had. And my question, my first question as an introduction would be about scale. If we work on the area that you showed us, do you need to work on the city, level of the city? Do you need to work on the level of the infrastructure that you left out? I thought it was a really interesting image where you left out the infrastructure and you showed us the possibilities and the generosity that was still available. Or should you even go further into detail and work on another scale? How did you tackle this problem?
I think during our design process, we tried a lot of these scenarios. We showed you one, and this is actually what we struggled with the most. And I think the main question of our design right now is how do you take on this complex situation with all of these different layers? of transport. And we just took one type of transport as a starting point, but it could just as well be any possible future. And the past has showed us that they change drastically, but these transport hubs, they are never designed for the future. They are always reacting. So perhaps also a question maybe to Rem is like, should these transport hubs then be made to be adaptable?
I have a question first, because there were two countries that were mentioned other than Holland, Stockholm, Sweden and Denmark. Is there a kind of shift in interest to Scandinavia, or are we treating Scandinavia as a new, why Stockholm?
We chose Stockholm because Stockholm has a very clear sustainability goals, and we are working, of course, with this subject of sustainability that actually, by definition, is meant to be positive. And Stockholm has these very clear goals, and especially also on infrastructure. They really want to get rid of the cars in their center.
But that, you know, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but that's where I think that I'm a little bit disappointed that there's kind of not a more critical sense toward Holland. Holland apparently is one of the worst countries in terms of sustainability. Its record is appalling. It's the worst in Europe. It has now declared kind of fantastic aims, but it's only kind of starting those aims in the next kind of round of governing. So I think if there's any kind of urgent issue to address that thing, it's this particular country. Why did you go for such a kind of plausible environment and not address a kind of really acute problem on your doorstep?
I think perhaps because because Stockholm is already ahead in this, we seem that it would be a plausible situation for Stockholm.
Yeah.
And if we imagine this future in the Netherlands, it becomes more difficult to understand and accept.
Yeah, but that I think in a certain way I'm really critical of that escape clause, because if somebody becomes difficult to imagine in the Netherlands and to accept in the Netherlands, I think that shows that there's a kind of really acute and blatancy. Blatant kind of reason to do it, and I have a feeling it would be much more kind of radical and eye-opening to see a kind of strong statement here than there, you know, because so that's one thing. Then I don't want to be mean, but I saw that there is an enormous increase in cycling in Sweden. And apparently in your kind of project, I saw a lot of public space. I saw open air swimming pools and open air theaters. Is it the effects of global warming in 25 years that you count on to make all of those possible? Because in Sweden the climate is horrendous and actually will forbid any cycling kind of half of the year, and it's really a trivial comment, but I also find it really too innocent, kind of really to illustrate the kind of situation with a condition that we know doesn't exist there.
Well, the goal of our studio will be to design a sustainable building. So I think the reason to choose Stockholm is that we have a kind of context where people are willing to go for this sustainability. So this master plan we're developing for our building in the end. The importance is the public space. We were wondering, we're developing this master plan this week, and of course we are thinking more about programs as well, like public places where people can go to. So it has to be more than only a public outdoor area.
Do you still have, how many months do you still have before finishing, because this is a graduation project, no?
Just started.
You just started, and you're finishing in June? April. Okay, okay, so you still have a lot of time to... So we can't be very critical. That's what I'm... just testing. Okay. No, because although I was intrigued by the image that you show, the potential of what is there when leaving out the infrastructure, I must say that when you saw the final image, I had the impression that everything had the same scale. The infrastructure had the same scale as the leisure activities, etc., etc. So there was a kind of randomness of these things. And I had the impression that you're too nice, in a way, in order to tackle the question. I don't think for my students, when they are graduating, they have a radical proposal, and the jury can hate it or can love it, and most probably they do both. But the student is taking a very clear position that he defends until the end, and I'm not seeking it and not finding it yet in what you showed. So I'm wondering if you would not benefit from the idea of looking into projects in history, or looking into the question of what is exactly sustainability and what can it be in the future, in order to nourish your thinking about the project.
I agree, but how big is your team?
We're 11 people.
11. Yeah, so I think it's big enough to, first of all, to maybe split up and to do different scenarios in the team. I think that you would gain enormously if you could develop an internal mechanism where the innocence is undone by yourselves, kind of, rather than kind of people from the outside telling you, oh, you cannot do this, you cannot do that. It's more interesting if you generate the critical kind of mood, and I think it would also be really interesting if you extrapolated a number of things and came to different conclusions that in the end you can decide to integrate or not. But I would expect of a larger team to develop a more dialectical relationship inside a team and more rigor inside a team. Rigor is a kind of ambiguous kind of term. I don't mean that it has to be totally respectable or something, but I would like to see simply more interaction in a team and more pressure generated by the team, on the team. I
think it's very interesting because you could actually do this also related to the themes that you're addressing. There is the idea of aesthetics. What is it exactly? The aesthetics of sustainability. What is aesthetics for you? Is it related to form, to materiality, to a kind of image that you have inspired by nostalgia of a kind of thing? And what is sustainability for you, and what is infrastructure? So you could really work on these three elements.
All right, yes. I think we did some research actually on the topic, what does sustainability look like? And I think one of the conclusions was that it does not have a face. No. Sustainability is a philosophy, it's not. And you can generate through these kind of teams that you know are sustainable, you can make a sustainable image. But there always has to be this thing in between, that the person who makes it and the person who looks at it knows.
But I want to come back to the issue of Scandinavia. Kind of reuse the let's say the diversity inside the office to also generate different insights, because in many cases, many people have very contradictory experiences in themselves, different educational systems, and we try to benefit from those differences. I think that Scandinavia is a kind of region of the world notoriously resistant to benefiting from differences. I think that the Dutch student body at this point is sufficiently diverse to also kind of feel those kind of pressures, or at least influences from diversity, I would expect.
I think we will definitely do that. Do we maybe have another question we'd like to ask about the project? We were just wondering, what do you like in public space?
Well, I give you a very honest answer. I think that most of the current, and sorry for sounding really maybe old-fashioned or dogmatic, most of the current design public spaces, I think, are horrendous, and I think they are disguised operations of creating order and wanting to avoid accidents or adventure or unpredictability. So they are kind of fields of predictability that are a soft way of policing the population. Yeah. But of course, that is the kind of design part, but there are always amazing kind of public possibilities in cities that are, you know, either designed in earlier kind of generations or improvised uses or neglected areas where public life kind of finds a plausible way to exist. Yeah?
Designed public space is preferable over the design space.
No, I think we have to be, and that's why I kind of insist so much on criticality. We have to be more critical. Yeah, because the typical client and the typical city and typical want no mischief. And I think mischief is very important. And I think if a profession lends itself for the elimination of mischief, somehow through design, I think it's a little bit sad. And in a way, you know, I don't want to kind of boast, but this building is a kind of building that allows mischief.
It's a very nice way of thinking. Is somebody of the room wanting to ask a question related to this particular project, or we continue and we have questions afterwards? I'm looking, nobody is daring. Oh, but you have to come up, huh?
I wonder why you decided to add leisure in the whole design.
Well, actually, we were thinking, why would you go to Slussen if not for transport? Because it is this big transport hub. And we imagine that in a future where everything is super efficient and everybody is served in all of their conveniences, then the only reason actually to still go outside is to visit each other, to meet each other, to relax, to be outside, to be out of the comfort zone. So we imagine that this would be the place for that activity. How would you fill in this space?
Can we have the curtains open, by the way?
I don't know how I would fill it up, but I think that at a transport hub you already meet so many people that you don't necessarily have to make new things at that place for people to meet, because they already meet there. But that's what I think.
But then there's the meeting of strangers and the meeting of people that you know, and those are different in that way. Yeah. There's transfer, like transfer from one traffic to another type of traffic, in which you meet a lot of strangers. But is that meeting?
Shall we? Yeah.
I think it would be great to shift to you,
Yeah.
and then have a kind of general
Final
discussion.
discussions. So, Dave. Thank you. As an introduction before further discussion with Rem, I must say I was very scared in the beginning of your project when I discovered it also last night, because of the way how you initially try to position space for the depot, a building which has raised a lot of discussion inside and outside the Netherlands and Rotterdam. And then all of a sudden you do this trick. And within the trick I see an image of Olafur Eliasson, who is laying down in a grass field this kind of mirrors. And I'm wondering if Petra Blaise also has not been inspired by this idea of the reflection of the ceiling, of the air and the clouds as a way of dealing with nature. So I thought that was a kind of very nice gesture of dealing with the enormousness of the depot within a space that you would like to keep as a void. The park with its design as it was. And then a second thing that I have not really got through to my elaboration of my mind is that there is this kind of Minecraft aesthetics in what you showed us in images, which it triggered me as a kind of new form of representing architecture, away from the renderings, also away from the collages and the drawings, but maybe it's a new and challenging way, because you're not an architect, but you come from the Willem de Kooning Academy. And so I thought it was kind of, for me, it's intriguing for me that the idea of representing a project could also be a way of conceiving the project. And it was something that might be possible in what you're doing. That were my two comments.
Well, there's an English word, mind experiment, which is simply saying this is not realistic, but I'm going to experiment anyway, and you did that, and that was very admirable and kind of refreshing. But I have a number of questions about it, but maybe before I would like to know what education are you actually following? Because the academy has a kind of wide range. Which section of it are you following?
I study spatial design.
Yeah, spatial.
So we sort of question what spatial design, what space could be. But at this moment, I'm doing a minor at the TU Delft. And I'm thinking of doing a master's there too. So I want to study art.
So it's maybe not as disconnected from architecture as it seems. No, yeah, too bad. I mean, we're obviously longing for a way out, for an escape. But yeah, I don't know whether it adds something that I think what you showed is a great solution for the collection building. But at the same time, I was a bit disappointed by the outcome of your thought experiment, because there were many configurations where you could really see an interesting tension between things, or where the proximity kind of really created an interesting shock, or where the absence seemed to be an interesting question. But then in the end it all came together in the kind of most reactionary composition of kind of public space that I've seen in the Netherlands since 1939. Yeah. In other words, I don't know whether you're aware of this kind of word. The Dutch had schools. Before World War II, there were the modernists and there were the conservatives, and the conservatives were called Delftse School. And your project was an excellent example of Delftse School, actually, and two of the buildings, and that is why it is a kind of interesting situation, because the Boijmans and I would say the Architecture Institute are perfect representations of that aesthetic or that mentality, and the white villas and the Kunsthal, I would say, are a different aesthetic. So it's okay to recompose, and very exciting, but it seemed that in the end you came down on the side of conservatism. So I really wanted to ask you why that is, with this kind of steel pond in the center even.
There was also a pattern, I don't know which number it was, but it was something about things being in the middle of a square. And I thought that would be an interesting point, or a thing of how the depot could look like. Because if it would be in the center, yeah, it would.
Somebody of the Kunsthal.
It would be more of an art piece
Why
itself.
didn't you leave it like that? It was perfect, zoals het was. Kunnen we weer terug naar die? Ja, dank u. Ja, fijn. Ja.
Instead of only storing the art that is in the depot itself becomes an art piece. itself, because
No,
it
no,
is so centered by...
that you did very well, and
Oh.
you can really show that, and I think your presentation was actually plausible, also because it was a different medium. So I agree with Véronique. My only question is, why did you then end up with this cozy, perfect thing with a thing in the middle, and you completely ignored the rest of the park that seemed to be condemned to become a kind of residue without any kind of further meaning, with some abstract triangles in it.
I think there's just one single answer, and that is that I liked it that way.
Okay. Okay. But one single answer that you liked it is not enough, because that is that is why I think education needs to be in itself kind of really critical, and of course you have to interrogate yourself, what your motives are, and you have to you actually have to have motives, and I really thought that's why the beginning was so strong, and you need to have a kind of stronger motivation or explanation for an end. And of course the beginning is very strong because it refuses a conclusion, and so maybe and now you have a kind of conclusion, but maybe you should think of something different than a conclusion.
Yeah, I finished this project 1.5 years ago, before the decision was made if the depot would actually be built.
Okay.
And this could be seen as a critical political statement,
Okay.
that the depot should be in a
And
different...
did you try to make it public? What? Did you try to make it public? Did you try to make it play a role in the discussion?
No.
It's a pity, because I think it was actually a kind of really strong kind of proposition. Huh?
It's true, because I think that what is interesting in your project is that you take the massiveness of the whole depot. You don't think that it should be elsewhere, or you keep it also in the museum park. So you respect actually the starting point of the project. You respect actually the project in itself. You just find another location and another way of dealing, another condition. And that's why I think I'm quite agreeing with the idea that the analysis was quite interesting of where you could put it and how there's a constellation of fragments within a field. And if you should leave the even covered field, or if you should make a kind of tension within it. So I'm quite agreeing with Rem that if it is just in the middle, not touching anything and just being very nicely put there, it is trying to be a kind of good architecture. Whether maybe we need some more bad architecture, especially on that location.
Maybe I'm not as... I'm just too nice to do something brutal like that, I think.
Yeah. Well, are we here at a kind of interesting moment? Somebody who's declaring himself too nice, interested in Scandinavia, or where are we heading? Explosion of niceness. Okay. Okay, so maybe we comment on that.
Somebody wants to react? There is a microphone that can travel all the way upwards. You only have to stand up and ask a question. Yeah, this is your chance of defending niceness. Or I see somebody raising a hand in the back, or was it just a gesture with a hand? No.
Yes, well, I think it's interesting to see what you did with the collection building. You know, have been fierce discussions about it. And I would like to ask you how you perceive the use of the space as the museum park, or you call it the museumplein. But well, let's assume we keep the buildings like they are. How would you respond on the on the programming of the museum park. What would be your idea when the collection building is where it's going to be in a few years?
I then think it's too intruding, because you saw in the rendering I made how big the depot would be if you compare it to the other musea. And I think in the design proposal it says that it should be subtle, but in my opinion it's not really. So I do think it should be there in a different way, and maybe
Because you're right, it's 4 stories, it's 4 Kunsthalls on top of each other. That's how high it's going to be. But once it's there, how do you think we're going to use the museum park as a space? Should we add more buildings? Should we what's going to be the big gesture here?
I'm not sure if adding more buildings would make the park better, because it's still a park. Maybe we can add more space, but not where we see them. So we can put it in the ground, or do something with the big garage that's there and that's flooded or something. But yeah, I don't know actually.
Maybe it's good to remind you that actually the initial plan of the city was to have the Kunsthal at the point where now that building will emerge. And so in the Kunsthal even, yeah. And then it was shifted here, and then he was supposed to be on that place. And so in that sense, I think the position itself is not nullifying the kind of the overall composition, I think.
There's a question there. Maybe you can stand up. And it's also always nice to know who you are and where, if you're studying or something.
No, I'm Frank. I'm teaching at the TU Eindhoven, and I work as an architect here in Rotterdam. And I was really curious, I think it was the Bjarke Ingels project in Copenhagen that you've shown as a positive space. And then, now we are now here in the Kunsthal. What I really appreciate about this building is, in a way, it's an experience, instead of just being an object. And for me, the new project of MVRDV is really being an object. Yeah, I don't really know how it's going to be from an experience from the inside out. And you like this project from Bjarke Ingels, which to me also has a little bit to do with movement. You go through this park and you constantly experience actually the object by wandering through it. The same with this building, going through it or passing it by. Now you reuse the shape of the pavilion for MVRDV, you push it into the ground. In a way, you do create an object on the floor which does something with movement. Did you do something with that? Just besides being the fact that it is like a hill? Did you approach it from that way, or was it just a mirroring shape?
I thought of it that it could be sort of a playing object too, because when I was in Copenhagen, there were in a playground tiny, actually the design I made, there were tiny balls in the ground you could play on, and I thought it could be something like that, but then in a much bigger scale.
But with the comments of today, if you would now be a little less nice and you would rethink what the round object on the square does as part of maybe movement, and if you reflect maybe on the project from Bjarke Ingels or on the Kunsthal where we are today, would you do it different? Would you maybe keep MPRDV's building to be provocative, but the way as it is, but therefore then do something different with the square itself?
It could be a fountain too. It shouldn't necessarily be this depot, but it was my subject, so I decided to use it as the depot it is.
Okay.
I think he's not as nice as he pretends to be. But I think you should go back and we should have a kind of more general kind of
Yeah, you can sit
situation.
again.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I have. Yeah, you want? I have. Yesterday we had a lecture here, which was explaining in detail that your generation doesn't read, but only looks, and that therefore there is a kind of major shift going on, kind of away from information and from literacy with words to literacy with images. I would say that the last project was kind of really about literacy with images. But I want to basically test you to see whether this is true, because I feel that there is an absence of kind of historical reference, as if historical references have become kind of unimportant. And I also feel that there is an absence of general information and knowledge about even recent history, which is actually handicapping you kind of rather than working for you. So you already have deeply disappointed me by your ignorance about the Maastricht Treaty. Now I want to ask you, who has ever heard of Delftse School? Okay, so that's slightly better. Yeah. Do you have kind of similar questions or things you want to test? Is a New Babylon? Okay, that's also pretty good. So how did you? I want to have a kind of maybe we have a discussion about whether kind of you actually read or not, or whether kind of all your other information is coming through kind of internet, through websites, through your telephone. Is that actually true or not? And maybe kind of random testimonies would be appreciated, because I don't know what your experience with your students is. And whether we should simply accept this theory or not.
No, we have the same problem, and I'm teaching in France, and where there's this enormous weight of the history of the École des Beaux-Arts weighing on my students. So I kind of obliged them to read, and we discuss texts within the studio, but it's very difficult for them to go so far as to have a discussion on the text. And but that's also a question that I would like to ask you. What I oblige them to do is to look into, to make an atlas of historical references, but to redraw the references. Because I have the impression that that the generations of students that are now with us have this idea of copy-paste and Twitter and what is the other thing, Snapchat, and you kind of rapidly send information and then it disappears again. That's what I was told. And so the idea of slowly redrawing a plan or a section and trying to understand by redrawing it what you can do with it for your project seems, for me, an interesting approach. It's like writing a text or taking notes while you were reading a text.
But the reason I'm questioning it is that I am not convinced, first of all, that it's true. And I have a kind of fear that basically because of this theory, you are kind of put away and almost separated by the acceptance of this theory, separated from an entire body of knowledge, simply because you're assumed not to be interested in it.
But maybe it's not true.
Yeah, maybe it's not true. So
somebody wants to react all the way on the top.
Thanks. Hi, thank you. I'm a student at TU Delft, and we're not really required to have I think it's not all too rigorous sometimes. The lessons on history and theory, you really have to delve in yourself. And in my own environment, I've seen actually more and more reading groups popping up. So people do have a really deep yearning for context, knowledge of history, and yeah, I think you shouldn't be too worried because we have also an incredible ability to organize.
So are you saying that in your generation or in your environment you see a deep yearning for the things that you're supposed to be beyond?
No, I mean, just to make sense of our environment, reading is still very important. And I think...
but I didn't hear, if you could come here, because then we have a kind of... Hi, I didn't understand what you said in the beginning about Delft. Whether you're on your own in terms of learning history, because that's what it seemed, and that there was at the same time still a strong yearning for books, blah, blah, blah.
I think the education is very packed, and theory and history have a very specific role in it, and they don't really sort of are interwoven in every facet of the courses.
So it's separate, yeah.
Yeah.
But did you suggest that there was a kind of even a kind of the interest in books is reactivated or getting bigger? Because that seemed also a statement.
Yeah, definitely. I think also self-publishing has seen a rise, and I think. If you go beyond the fact that we might not read, I think that is a speculation, then you can see there's actually right now an incredible possibility space for the written word and the image culture to intertwine in all kinds of different ways. Yeah. So I think it's a blatant statement to say that we don't read.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's more questions. Can maybe come forward so that becomes a bit more active. But I also felt yesterday that this kind of separation and particularly this description of your generation is highly unfair and in a certain way also dangerous because it pushes you, it typecasts you in a way which I think is not productive, or not even encouraging you to do anything. Yeah? Hi.
Hello, I'm a student in TU Eindhoven. It's my first year in Masters. What I wanted to say about education, I happen to have a double degree. I started off with journalism, just like you did, because I couldn't get into architecture school. So my journey in architecture started about 11 years ago, and the matter that was most concerning for us in Romania, because I come from a previously communist country, was that in order to support ourselves through architecture school, we really had to kind of burden our entire family for it, because the tuition fees were not low, and also being able to study full-time was something that needed commitment for us. So one of the things that kind of triggered me into understanding to what extent can we actually afford to go into reading, to dive deeper into those books, was to what extent can we enable a mutual communication from the industry with us as students to be able to become practitioners or to start learning and also gaining money while being in school. And that was a very concerning problem for me. So then somewhere in my second year of school, I had tuberculosis, which is a really bad disease, and it's eradicated in the world, but it happens in Romania, especially when you study 2 universities in the same time. And to shorten my story, it challenged me a lot to go beyond. And I started a communication company for architects, and I realized that we were only promoting ourselves within the industry, so the only information was circulating inside our own industry. So we didn't necessarily get information from outside. There wasn't enough communication with other, economists that would explain what the context is. So when you're giving us books in architecture, it's actually very annoying because the information is not circulating enough. We should be reading other things. Like I'm reading Piketty with Capital. So I'm reading a lot of other things in economy because I need to understand the bigger picture. And we're only reading our own lectures. Of course, I've read your books. I'm sorry, my hand is a little bit shaking. I'm excited about this moment because I've actually. Because I've traveled to Venice just to see your Biennale, which is not cheap for someone that's coming from Eastern Europe, and my parents earn not as much, of course. So investing into education is a matter of discussion more than do we read, you know? That's my piece of thought. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. I think that the market and let's say our current dependence on the market has been kind of underlying theme of the entire situation. And I know exactly what you felt because I went to an extremely expensive school and had to kind of earn my own money and etc. And it is, of course, very difficult to understand that only 30 or 40 years ago you could study in Delft for 9 years and that you had a kind of fixed income every year, and that now in a much richer kind of situation we cannot afford that anymore. And of course that may be actually, as you say, explain why people don't read, because they don't have the time or the opportunity to read. And so that is why also these explanations about a visual generation may hide actually all kinds of economic distress or inequalities. Huh?
They do contribute, because the fact that we can throw away information through an entire network of, I don't know, I have 2,500 people in my network, they can all see the live presentation of this masterclass, and they wouldn't have been able to do that without this media. So I think there needs to be a connection between them, but also a selection of what are our sources of information, because we're really talking about reading more, but we're not teaching people what to read and how to think. And I've learned about that when I went to Think Creative Leadership School. I took a mentorship there to understand how I can take the education of architects to another level. And they weren't even questioning about that. They weren't seeing that creative minds have a different wiring of the brain, and we should be feeding different kind of information, and we should be enhancing our multiple connections in the brain, because, yeah.
Wait. I think there are some teachers here. Is that correct? Because I'm kind of really surprised that we have a kind of now a student body, and I raised the issue in the Stockholm case, a student body which is actually very diverse, but that we are still kind of thinking about architecture as a completely white and completely Scandinavian. That's why I'm kind of so sensitive to that reference kind of world. And we have so many now kind of in our country, in our student bodies, totally different experiences that can really could contribute to introduce pressure also, and to introduce critical kind of perspectives that we cannot generate, we don't generate on ourselves. So is there any teacher in the room that can clarify or talk about that?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah?
Oh. I'm Harm Scholtes. I'm course director of spatial design at the Willem de Kooning Academy. Our first agenda point is very urgent right now, is to diversify our student identity, especially abroad, but also in the south of Rotterdam. There are many talents, many hidden talents we want to really stimulate to access our white male community like me, this kind of boring guys, 50-year-old, education in architecture. We want to refresh this drastically in the future. That's actually a very, and on the other hand, Mr. Rutte, our nice Prime Minister, who had this first debate yesterday. Unfortunately, the reduction of contact hours from, let's say, 24 hours a week 2 or 3 years ago is drastically now coming up to about 12 a week. So we have like sometimes like 5 minutes maximum, often 3 minutes to get to the point, get to the core point, which is a quite alarming situation in art education. TU Delft, TU Eindhoven is more, like a bit more, you know, master, but this is the situation we're in, and we do our very best to do everything we have, because we all love our jobs, and we all love our students to survive. Thanks to it. Yeah.
But this is exactly why I'm kind of insisting on the kind of energy that is embodied in the student body, and also the richness of experience. If you have already kind of spent, I don't know how many years in Romania, you are yourself are an expert in something, you know, an expert in surviving in that kind of economic climate, but also an expert in what communism actually maybe didn't offer, but might still have to offer, and anyway, an experience of different political systems, and therefore a different kind of awareness than we have. And particularly in the kind of situation where the state is becoming more and more negligent and more mechanical, I think you have to generate a lot of the insight yourself, yeah?
So well, that's what I said. So you do a plea for criticism, because I was wondering today that we are in this building, you developed it in a context where you were brutal and boring and blatant, it to go very fast, and we saw today a lot of optimism, happiness, niceness, etc. I'm not sure that the situation is leading us to, I'm very questioning the very idea of the optimism in this generation today. I'm wondering if it is something that we can't understand anymore, because I'm also part of the older generation, unfortunately already, or if there is also a critical stance in your optimism that we haven't found yet, because we are post-political, post-historical, we are dealing with a scattered Europe and even a scattered world. So I think it is our duty in a way to continue to be critical, but maybe the tools have changed. I don't know. That's a question I
don't know either, yeah.
Very urgent last questions? Yes?
Yes, I wanted to say that I have the feeling I'm not supposed to be here, because I was actually on excursion, and I'm from the Art Academy The Hague, the Royal Academy of Arts. My name is Joyce Bakker. And I have the feeling that the TU's kind of miss a connection to the self, in the sense of what your design identity is. And if you connect, for example, history to your design identity, it gets more interesting also to read more, because in our case we have design analysis and we have to analyze this building, for example. But besides that, we also have to think about who we want to be and how that can contribute. And that also in context with, we have lectures about architecture, and architecture is not said, oh, this building is built in this period and this is what it means, but it starts with a happening and a moment in history. And as a reaction on that, we talk about buildings that were built in that period. So I think that's a change in education and systems in schools. And what I would suggest is to collaborate more, because I learned a lot today already about more technical and more insights, but I won't say the feeling aspect, but more the diving deep into the context and what it means to you and what you can get out of it, or what it meant in that certain time and period. That I don't know quite where I want to go, because I feel a bit impressed by everyone, but yeah.
But I think that there is an important role for all the students present today. The OASE issue, the OASE journal exists since the beginning of the 1980s. I'm only part of this story 10 years. It was founded by the students in Delft. It was not a project of the professors, it was not a project of the institution, it was a project of self-education by the students, because they thought at that time that their education was lacking and was not interesting enough, and so they went for a collaboration, first within the university and then with Eindhoven, in order to get nourished in a way, because they thought that it was not happening in the Netherlands at that time. So it was a kind of project of auto-education, self-education. And I think that there lies a very interesting challenge for you.
I'm Thomas. I'm a student at TU Delft and a co-founder of an architecture office there. And to me, it seems, also what you've been discussing, the architect seems to lose maybe the connection to the past a bit, because the profession seems to shift towards a future, a strategic position. So it's like 2 of the 3 projects we saw today, they were actually not reacting, they were predicting. They were taking place in the future, a future that we don't even know if it happens that way. But to do so, I think, since the world, the globalized world is changing at this rapid speed, looking at the past 5 years might be considered to be more important for us to predict the next 30 years than to look back 100 years. Because the shift of change is drastically increasing, and that's why to predict the future and to develop the strategies of the future, it's more interesting, potentially, to look at the recent past rather than the past that is further away.
I totally disagree, because basically looking at the recent past is kind of something that you don't have to look at. You experience it, and it's part of your DNA, and everyone does it. And I think that exactly if you stay within that myopic situation, you can become a victim of profound misunderstandings. One of the profound misunderstandings is that everything changed very rapidly. I cannot say enough how slowly change is, even in this digital era. I was kind of an unbelievable kind of 30 years ago, kind of for the first time, trying to think about what the relationship between the digital world and the physical world was. And still we're having exactly the same discussion. It hasn't changed at all. The kind of domination of the digital that was kind of predicted didn't actually happen. The kind of plausibility of the material world, which was announced 30 years ago, didn't happen. So I think that you actually really need every moment a kind of real awareness of what happened 25 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and if possible even longer, because that is the only way in which you can kind of have any precision in terms of estimating what is going on now. No applause, please. but
So, is this a very, very urgent last question? Yes? Okay, one last one, and then we have to stop. The person in the back.
Hi, my name is Reza. I'm from TU Delft, and I think it's a little bit different. I'm urbanist, so I'm from urbanism. And I think, because from what I heard until now is from architects and architecture, so I think it's a good, maybe I can give a small remarks about from the point of view of urbanism. I think in terms of thinking about literature and reading, and I think it's more interesting is about understanding the thought of the people, because right now I'm doing my thesis and I'm talking about Newtown, development of Newtown, but then the way I try to make it is just to mix it up with the idea of urban vitality, which are talk about, for example, by Jan Gehl. There's research recently that in 2014, I think most of urbanism students refer Jan Gehl's really a lot. But then there's a critical thinking about, but why they refer Jan Gehl's a lot. So in that sense, there's a really interesting book about it called Everyday Urbanism by Margaret Crawford, where she actually criticized Jan Gehl's and placemakings and all this mainstream understanding of public spaces a lot, because there's a narrative of loss. They're only talking about this feel-good urbanism. So in that sense, understanding this conversation about public space and in relation to what actually happened, what is the politics of public space is interesting. So I think I will not say that this understanding of reading a lot is gone right now in the students, especially in urbanism, because we try to understand that really from the thought, and even all these public space activists are against Le Corbusier, because in the 20s he actually have this book of City of Tomorrow that really want to make cities from scratch. But then if I try to understand the point of view from his point of view, then it makes sense, because at that time the condition of the city is really bad. That's why he wanted to make it from scratch. So just by understanding this fast conversation by myself is already helping me a lot. So I think, yeah, that's just a remark for me from urbanism point of view. Thanks.
Thank you for the remark, which I think is kind of making a résumé, I don't know how the word in English is, of recapitulation of what we experienced. I thought it was very challenging. I thought it was a very strange setup when you first contacted me, but I think it was really nice having both the conversation on the history of the building and the historical moment in which this project was conceived, and then having a very challenging discussion with actually all of you on the situations that you are living today as architectural students. What I remembered maybe is an idea of slowness, an idea of criticality, and an idea of awareness of the moment that we are all living and in which you as young architects to be are being challenged every day. I would like to thank David and Eva and Dave for their contributions, the whole room for challenging us within the debate, and the Kunsthal for having us, and of course Rem for being here today. Thank you.